live stream lecture. Today I'm going to be giving you a longer version of the video that I made about Zizek and how to find love, which is to say this is going to be a 30-minute live stream lecture in which I try to give you a step-by-step explanation as to Slavoj Zizek's philosophy of love and how it works, and perhaps how you can also use it to think about love in your own life. First, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody for being here today. Makes me very happy that we have this live stream community of like-minded philosophy enthusiasts. Always brings me very much joy. And I'd also like to say that if you'd like to learn more about Zizek's philosophy of love, that you can find one of my ebooks titled Sisyphus in Love on Patreon, which is part of the Complete Guide to Zizek ebook series, volumes 1 through 8. Basically, if you sign up to the top tier on Patreon, you can download all the books. It's a recurring quarterly subscription, so I think by now there's like 10 or 11 even of them. So thank you everybody for being here this morning, and this is going to be a live stream lecture on Zizek's theory of love. I already posted a 10-minute version, excuse me, a 10-minute version, and today I thought it might be fun to actually go a little bit deeper into the theory and provide you with a sort of step-by-step analysis of Zizek's arguments as it pertains to love. But first, I'd like to preface this with a simple statement, which is that this is not simply Zizek's take on love. This is not simply a philosopher speaking on something. Instead, it's quite important to note that the topic and theme of love as a concept, as a philosophical problem, if you will, has an enormously lengthy history going all the way back to the origins of Western metaphysics and philosophy, namely Plato's discussion of love, and how Plato argues that love turns wise men into fools. But more than that, within Hegel's own philosophy, love functions as what you might call a metaphor for his entire metaphysical system. And so when Zizek writes about love, he's not simply applying his philosophy to the idea of love in the manner of a self-help video, although there are attributes of that. Instead, it is quite important to note that love is a key conceptual component within Zizek's body of work as such. It's similar to when Zizek talks about movies. He's not just giving you a take on movies, he's also integrating the movie as an illustration or an example into his overall philosophical argument. In fact, many philosophers, at least the more serious-minded ones within the contemporary, if you will, left-wing or French tradition, what sometimes is referred to as the continental thinkers, really dislike this idea that you would simply have a take on something, that you would sprinkle some philosophy on some universal notion. Instead, the theme of love is quite important to Zizek's work as a serious conceptual idea. And so the basic goal of this live stream lecture today, and hello everybody who's joining us live, wonderful that you're here, is to flesh out the conceptual philosophical components of Zizek's argument about love. And if you simply want the simplified 10-minute version that leaves out the complexities, you can find that in my video titled Zizek on How to Find Love. Okay, so let's begin. First, I think it's quite important to note that Zizek consistently characterizes love as a violent event. These are his literal words. Love is a violent event. And on the one hand, the simplest way to interpret that is that Zizek is here making an anti-romantic gesture, or so it would seem. Instead of the universalization of love into loving your neighbor and loving your family and loving the world, and by extension, loving being a capitalist subject, McDonald's I am loving it, this unknowable it of the capitalist real, which you are supposed to love like yourself, as Lacan writes, love your symptom like yourself. Against this, Zizek argues that love is a violent event, that love presents a rupture of sorts, a catalyst, a crack. And I'm going to try to explain here in the first segment of this live stream why love is a violent event. And apologies to those of you who have followed these classes for a long time, because I have covered this before, and you can also find it in my ebook titled Sisyphus in Love. So if you want to understand why love is a violent event, you basically have to break it down into two components, violence and event. And violence is something that for Zizek has a very different meaning from what you might otherwise associate with the term. And the word event derives from Alain Badiou's theory of the truth event. In other words, when Zizek argues that love is a violent event, he is already giving you the conceptual framework within which you can situate love for Zizek's philosophy. So let me give you the easiest way to understand this argument. Why is love a violent event? Well, the common sense answer is that love is a violent event because it radically disrupts your sense of self. It turns you upside down. When you fall in love, you are no longer yourself. You start to behave irrationally. You are no longer happy. This is the famous neurotic motif of plucking the petals off the flower and saying, she loves me not. She loves me not. There's a kind of bliss in this hysterical position of unrequited love. Namely, does the other person love me back? In fact, it's a key mechanism of idealization that it corresponds to a form of narcissism. As Kafka once wrote, Kafka, although I wouldn't characterize as a narcissist, but as Kafka once wrote, when I love someone, in this case Milena, I place them on a pedestal so high above me that it feels like I can never reach them. And I can return to this later, but here we have love as a kind of barrier. The subject wants the object of his affection, but the easiest way to keep the object of his affection intact is precisely to love the separation between them. Which is to say, if you walk up to them and you say, do you love me? And they say no, then your fantasy shatters. But as long as you can love them from a distance, you feel like something might happen. And so a crush is safe. Idealization is safe. It essentially functions on behalf of the subject, but it doesn't actually engage with the true radical traumatic core of love as such. But Zizek's argument, love is a violent event, in its most simple common sense form, means that love comes to us as an inconvenient disruption that rips us out of our ordinary day-to-day life and satisfaction and turns us into irrational, hysteric madmen. I'm sure that some of you have experienced this at some point in your life. Of course, the argument here, the underlying argument, is that within contemporary liberal permissive societies, anything that disrupts your biopolitical optimization, anything that keeps you from going to the gym or sleeping your 8 hours or clocking in at work and being productive, anything that goes against this is a threat, is suspect. Therefore, we try to eliminate the most radical core of love, the disruptive element, and we simply turn it into something which can be experienced on the side, a hookup app, a dating app, etc. Zizek's basic argument, which I've laid out before, is that in a liberal permissive society, we are free, more free than ever, but only nominally so. And in the same way, when it comes to relationships, we are more free to pursue romantic attachment, whether it's through dating apps or even being able to meet people around the world. And yet it's become more difficult than ever before to actually have meaningful, long-lasting connections and relationships. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the theory here. Zizek argues that love is a violent event. What makes it violent? Well, we've already heard that love for Zizek is something which tears you out of your ordinary reality. It disrupts your sense of self, your sense of security. In this sense, it's a dizzying event. It's like you slip on a banana peel and suddenly the world is upside down. Similar to what Hegel once characterized as die umgekehrte Welt, or the topsy-turvy world, as some English translators deem it. And for Zizek, violence has a very different connotation than it has in the ordinary parlance. In everyday life, violence is something that is inflicted upon somebody else. Like, if somebody is murdered, this is a violent act. If somebody is hit by a car, this is a violent act. If police oppression takes place in the streets, we have here a public display of violence. Against this, Zizek argues that true violence is that which silently, almost invisibly, tacitly, changes the manner in which we experience reality as such. And this is actually a Lacanian argument because one of the central Lacanian principles is that fantasy is not that which distracts from reality. In other words, fantasy is not mere escapism. Instead, and this is key, fantasy is how you access reality. You can't access reality as such, an sich. Instead, it has to have a fantasy frame through which you access it. Therefore, the ultimate, or what Lacan deems fundamental fantasy, is precisely this idea of a reality which is not mediated through some subjective frame. A little bit how, like, the neutral person says that they have no side, when we all know that to be neutral is to be tacitly on the side of the more powerful one, on the side of the status quo. Zizek's argument, therefore, is that something is violent if it can change our fantasy frame, if it can change the way in which reality appears to us. This means that true violence isn't violence which happens against the backdrop of reality. True violence is that which changes reality itself. This is true power for Zizek. It's also why he argues that we should resist what he calls the hermeneutic temptation, to simply look at and analyze violence as it happens explosively in the world, the injustice of a policeman beating a protester, the injustice of what's happening in Gaza, etc. Instead, he argues we have to look at the structural mechanisms underlying this form of violence, by which they are tacitly legitimized or accepted as inevitable. Hence, to put it in a simple formula, Zizek's argument about violence is that violence that you see every day is not really violent. In fact, in a strange way, it actually serves to maintain the status quo. It's the old Terry Pratchett joke that what you read in the paper shouldn't be called news, it should be called olds, because you're just reading the same thing over and over again, tacitly and passively accepting that nothing can be changed. In other words, looking at violence as such induces us to be cynical. Nothing can be done about it, it simply exists. Whereas for Zizek, true violence is that which changes reality as such. In other words, that which affects the fantasy frame through which we accept what exists as given. Hence, violence becomes irreducibly attached to the project of philosophy as such. After all, if philosophy begins as soon as we refuse to accept what exists as given, which is already part of the Socratic project of philosophy, the radical questioning of the status quo and common sense, then philosophy is a violent practice. It is a revolutionary practice in this sense. Not violent in the sense of wanting to hit you over the head or starting an uprising. Often these uprisings are pseudo-uprisings. Think about the January 6th storming of the Capitol. This appeared to us as a violent event in its outward form, but fundamentally it changed nothing. Nothing was done once the rioters and the protesters had entered into the Capitol. Here we have a pseudo-event. Against this, Zizek's argument is that true violence is that which changes reality. And in order to change reality, you have to change the fantasy frame. Love is, in this precise sense, extremely violent. Love changes your fantasy frame. When you are in love, everything looks different. Reality looks different. You become someone else. Therefore, love is for Zizek violent. It tears you out of your ordinary existence. And in so doing, it changes you, but perhaps more importantly, it literally changes the way reality appears to you. Now let's link that to the second theoretical component, love as a violent event. So I already said that event is a term that Zizek takes from Alain Badiou, the contemporary French radical philosopher. And it's important to note here that when Zizek says event, what he really means is a truth event. That's Badiou's term. And for Badiou, a truth event, to put it very, very simply, even though it's a complicated argument, is that a truth event is something which appears to us as extraneous, as contingent, i.e. accidental, but yet in this seeming accidental occurrence, it appears to reveal a truth within us that is therefore experienced as necessary. Now, it's important to note that for Alain Badiou, an event isn't just about love. Like, an event can also be an eventual historical situation. like 9/11 constitutes an event, something which happens seemingly out of the blue, which nevertheless reveals America and the United States in particular to itself in a radically different way, which then becomes wrapped up in the seeming inevitability of its wars abroad and the recurring cycle of violence in the Middle East that is then brought back home to the United States. But let's stick to love for a moment. When you fall in love, let's face it, most of the time it's accidental. You meet somebody on the street, you meet them online. It's the famous Hollywood theme of a meet cute, where two people are walking their dogs in the park and their leashes become entangled. Or you're at a cafe and you drop something and she drops something and you both reach down to get it, and for a moment underneath the table you make eye contact. Classic meet cute Hollywood tropes. And yet here we have something which is completely accidental, totally contingent. And yet, if those two people fall in love, then retroactively will appear to them as if it was always meant to be, even if they don't really believe it. Like, that's really important. Even if they don't really believe that they were meant to be, like, you're with your partner and you love them to death, but you say it was meant to be, but you also know that it maybe could have gone differently, sliding doors, etc. This process by which a contingent event is internalized or received by the subject as inevitable, as fated, is therefore something which follows the mechanism or the formula of Alain Badiou's truth event. It is something radically extraneous to the subject, which nevertheless reveals within the subject what appears to be his or her inner truth. Now, it's important to note here that Alain Badiou argues that this event isn't entirely passive, which is to say, it's not simply something that happens to you. That would be too simple. Like, I've advocated before, as Zizek has advocated, that the best way to find love is to not go looking for it, to simply be focused on what you're doing, and then at a certain point, love will come and pull out the carpet from underneath you. But there's something more complicated at work here, theoretically, which is that when it comes to a truth event for Badiou, the subject has to, in some way, recognize himself in the call of the other, has to hear something in which he hears his own voice. And this is something that is very difficult to quantify, right? When you're out with people and you're meeting them, what exactly makes it so that you meet one person and you think, that's the person for me? Of course, on a pheromonal level, we can talk about attraction. On a psychological level, we can talk about what attracts people in each other. But what's key for Badiou is that there's a certain moment at which the subject must decide to act, must decide to take a leap of faith, to take the plunge, to say, yes, I think I like this person, but now I'm going to be in love with them. And this can itself be something that causes hysteria in the subjects when you're in love. Do I really love them? Do I love the idea of them? Do I really want to be in love? Because being in love is very inconvenient to me right now. These complicated maneuvers and thought processes are part of the event. In other words, the event is presented to the subject, but in a sense, the subject must recognize himself in it, must heed the call. Of course, for Badiou, as for Zizek, there is here an analogy between love as event and the revolutionary subject. A revolutionary subject walks by, seeing injustice happening every day in the world, and yet at one point the subject says, I can't take it anymore. At one point the subject says, I know I have to act, I have to do something. In other words, at a certain point, the subject recognized within himself a revolutionary call. I've said this many times before, but this is also linked to Zizek's interpretation of Kantian freedom, the Kantian ethical notion of du kannst denn du sollst, you can because you must. When we encounter a truth event, be it love or political resistance, you come to a point where it feels like you choose to act precisely because it seems like you have no choice but to act. And this paradox is precisely the evental occurrence. And I'll return to that later when we bring back the Hegelian component. So keep that in mind. This means that for Zizek, when he says that love is a violent event, he means that it is violent in his sense, which is to say that it is that which affects the fantasy frame through which we view reality, thereby changing reality as such. and nothing could be more violent than that which affects what reality is. And secondly, it's an event in the Bajun sense, in that it is a radically contingent thing, which nevertheless appears to us as an inevitability, as revealing to us our true self. Of course, without wanting to bring Lacan into this, you can already see how there's a certain paradox by which the other somehow appears to you as the one who has the key to your authentic inner being, as it were. And I use authentic in parentheses here. This is part of the fantasy, of course, when you fall in love, that you are more truly yourself because you've fallen in love with the stranger. I used to see TikTok videos where people would suddenly have this realization that they're sitting in the car with someone that they've been married to for 10 years, and that person is a complete and utter stranger, just a random human being that somehow has woven itself into the fabric of your joint life. And there is, of course, something very beautiful about that. Let's make a little detour here into Freud. Freud has a kind of an interesting thing, which is that Freud writes about the neighbor. And of course, we all know the Christian maxim, love your neighbor, love thy neighbor. And Freud says that it's actually impossible to love your neighbor. Freud says that the neighbor is not a real human being, not a real person, which is to say, it's not simply the person who lives next to you, it's the horrible thing, the it, the other which resides on the other side of the hedge or the other side of the wall, who makes noises at night and coughs and etc. And that therefore the neighbor is the projection of this unlovable thing. And yet this is not an argument against the principle of loving your neighbor, but precisely an argument for it. After all, love your neighbor means to no longer see them as neighbor. In a Freudian sense, as long as they are the neighbor, they are the monster. They are the person on the other side of the wall who torments you. And yet, as soon as you know them as a human being, as soon as you know their name and you've gotten to know their family, etc., you might still dislike them, but you cannot see them as a neighbor. You cannot simply treat them as a complete other to you. In fact, I always think that like when it comes to driving in the United States, it's really easy to be angry with other drivers because we don't see them, because we just see a car. And as soon as you get to know people, it becomes really difficult to hate them. This is, of course, part of the liberal consensus that we should all put aside our differences, one human race, etc., blah, blah, blah. But nothing could be less true. It's radical differences between us that make each other lovable to ourselves. Therefore, when Freud says that the neighbor is an unlovable, monstrous thing that resides on the other side of the wall, he is still following the logic of love thy neighbor. Love thy neighbor, in this sense, means that as soon as you love them, they're no longer a neighbor. Essentially what this all points towards is the way in which love radically complicates the notion of the universal and the particular. This is something that's already implicit in theological theories about agape, or universal love. Often this is translated into unconditional love, like you should love people unconditionally. And yet it's almost the other way around, which is to say that agape, or universal love, is not love for the particular in its universal substance, but instead the other way around. It is that love is itself universal by means of radical particularization. To make that less abstract, Zizek argues that when you love one person, it's radically exclusionary. You can't really be in love with everybody. You can't have those emotions for everybody. You have them for one person against everybody else. This means that there's something solipsistic about love. It's you and that person contra mundum, as Sebastian says in Brideshead Revisited, against the world. You take a stance together against the world. And this means that there's something quite radical about love, in that love is that which takes people out of their ordinary lived existence. And it's in the state of love that they suddenly become what you might call preparatory revolutionary subjects, whose love is more important than their life. In fact, for Zizek, this is the core of love in revolution, as Che Guevara also pointed out, that the revolutionary subject is a subject who is in love, who is possessed by a kind of madness in which the ordinary reality no longer suffices. in which a battle must be staged each and every day to preserve that which is worth fighting for more than anything else. Therefore, the revolutionary subject is in love with his destiny. What happens within a contemporary liberal permissive society is that we are in love with the idea of love itself, which is a short circuit. We are in love with being lovable, with loving ourselves. We're in love with the notion of romantic love, but we lose the radical component of love, the revolutionary component of love. That love is that which turns us into irrational fools so that we might chase that which is more important than anything else. When a basketball player says that they are willing to die for their game, what they mean is that they love their game. When somebody is willing to die for their partner, they do it for love. It's an irrational tendency. Love turns us into fools, as Plato says quite seriously. And this madness for Zizek is constitutive. Because for Zizek, the ultimate madness is to simply participate in ordinary day-to-day lived reality as if nothing were up, as if we're simply the world as it exists in its most natural and given form. Of course, ideology for Zizek is precisely that which suggests that what exists is natural, untouchable, unchangeable. Against ideology, love is a disruption. Love is that which radically disrupts ideology. Hence why capitalism tries so hard to turn love into an ideology. That you simply have to love it, as McDonald's says. The real of capitalist enjoyment being this universal love. Against this, Zizek argues that the true universal element of love is precisely in its radically particularizing gesture, loving one person against everybody else, loving one thing against everything else, living your life for one cause. That for Zizek is true love and the revolutionary core within the loving subject as such. Of course, we have more sentimental attitudes toward this, like Tolstoy, who late in his life, when he became the mystical guru, argued that to love someone is to light a candle in their hearts, which then sets aflame other candles, etc. All of which is true, but almost neuters this radical component of love. Love and sacrifice are, of course, intertwined in this sense. To sacrifice oneself is to do the ultimate irrational act, to forego self-preservation for love. Therefore, love has something threatening, both to the subject and to the reality, the existing order. The loving subject is the one who has the potential to be the revolutionary subject. Hence why Zizek argues that true revolutionary love is love of the cause, what he calls the third thing, or dritte Sache, which is a little, if you will, nugget that he takes from Bertolt Brecht, a poem about die dritte Sache. And the third thing, the first thing being you and your love for each other being the second thing, the third thing is the higher thing that you make yourself subject to, the revolutionary cause of your love. And for Zizek, there is no higher love. Love isn't simply two people meeting and liking each other. This would just be a mutual feeling of affection. Instead, love is when together you can make yourself radically subject to something higher than yourself, to some cause. And for Zizek, this is the potential of love. Two people who join forces, as Dr. Seuss once quipped, when two people whose weirdness is compatible join forces, they call it love. And Zizek has a similar idea, which is that love is when two people join forces who have a similar passion that animates their very lived existence. Therefore, for Zizek, it's almost like a threefold movement. When you fall in love, you lose yourself. But when you find someone who loves that which you love, you find yourself together, as it were. This for Zizek is the revolutionary cause, the revolutionary subject, the subject of love. Now, I'd like to very briefly end here, although we've run out of time, by giving you a very short version of how this relates back to Hegel, as I promised before. So I already said that Hegel uses love as a metaphor of sorts for his phenomenology of spirit. And the way in which that works is like this. Warning, this is going to be highly abstract. I'm going to rush this a bit. The central Hegelian argument, the central maxim, is substance as subject, essence as appearance, and, if you will, vice versa. This radically goes against the traditional metaphysical divide initiated by Plato, in which we have essence versus subject. namely the world of essence, pure form, versus the world of phenomena, objects that appear to us, the rational subject. Hegel's argument is that essence is itself appearance. Not an illusion, but the other way around. Essence appears only in and through phenomena. Hence, what Kant deemed the barrier to essence, subjective reason, is for Hegel the very key to essence. Namely, essence not as the mystical content of pure form, but instead as the content within the form as to the emerging impossibility of pure form made apparent to the subject. Essence as appearance. Now, the reason that love is a metaphor for this, for Hegel, is that love functions in the same way. In a sense, you don't believe in love until you've experienced it. It simply exists as like essence, pure form, the idea of love. And yet, when love happens in your life, it is a radically particular experience. It's not universal. It happens only to you. In fact, everyone who falls in love feels like they are the first person to have discovered it. And yet, in this radical particularity, being in love is universal. Which say love is a paradox. It's what makes us feel like we are completely ourselves against the world, contra mundum, solipsism to the extreme. And yet, it is the most universal thing in us. It is that which connects us to everybody else. And so we're back at agape. We're back at universal love, namely not unconditional love for one person, but precisely the other way around. Love for one person, which is flawed and irregular and contingent, and yet in this very substance is universal across us as a species. Hence, the breakdown of essence into appearance and vice versa, the dialectical relationship between essence and appearance, is for Hegel something which functions also in love. Love is that which is universal, but appears to us as radically contingent or particular. And in this particularization reveals itself in its true universality. The exception is the rule in this sense. Now, that's very complicated, and I'll admit that I don't have enough time to fully elaborate it here. Some of you will already be familiar with it from previous lectures. Perhaps we can touch upon it next week. But that is the more dense, theoretical, conceptual version of Zizek's take on love, which hopefully will help you flesh out the 10-minute video that I made. Thank you so much for watching. It's extremely rewarding to me that we're here together, and thank you for being part of this community. If you'd like to read more about love, I released an ebook titled Sisyphus in Love, which is about Zizek's philosophy of love, which is part of the Complete Guide to Zizek ebook series, which you can find on Patreon. Until then, thank you so much for being here. I will be joining the patrons in our Discord seminar in mere minutes, so I will see you there. Bye-bye.